Again, want to welcome you today. If you have missed out on any of the previous sermons, we're in a series called The Separation of Church and Hate, where we've been addressing polarization. And it has touched on politics because we're in a political season and we see a lot of political polarization out there. But polarization happens a lot of ways. It's happening even in the midst of our church, in the United Methodist Church, as there are groups looking to separate over theological issues. And so the question becomes, as we think about this, is how do we get along with people that we disagree with? How do we act as Christians, as followers of Christ, in a world that is okay with canceling others out who think differently than we do? And so that's where we're at today. If you've missed any of it, it's online on YouTube, or you can find it on our website through podcasts, through sermons, if that's your thing as well. One of the most remarkable people over the last 100 or so years is Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a lawyer, an anti-colonial nationalist, a political ethicist, a spiritual leader who utilized nonviolent forms of protest to seek and campaign for India's independence from Great Britain. Gandhi was a practicing Hindu who was also widely read and open-minded to exploring spiritually and finding truth wherever Gandhi might have found truth. One of Gandhi's friends was the Methodist missionary E. Stanley Jones. It is said that Jesus' teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, his conversations with Jones and other Christians, helped influence him, especially on the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus teaches how we should turn the other cheek. And this influenced Gandhi in his nonviolent forms of protest, which in turn influenced the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement. Now, there is a story about Gandhi who one day while he was in Calcutta went to visit one of the Christian churches there. And as Gandhi approached the sanctuary doors of the church, the ushers came out and met him there and told him that he was not welcome to come inside the church because Gandhi was not from a high enough caste. The caste system is a form of segregation in India, and based on where you are, the lowest caste are untouchables that no one will deal with, and only if you are the highest caste you have privileges there. And so Gandhi evidently was not from the right caste, and that church said that we are only for high caste Indians and for white folks to come into. Gandhi, at that point, the story goes, rejected Christianity outright because of the forms of segregation that he experienced practiced within the church there in India. Gandhi, though, found Jesus to be a great teacher. In fact, even calling Jesus one of the greatest teachers that all mankind has encountered. The Dr. J.H. Holmes, a Swarthmore professor who conversed with Gandhi on several occasions, trading letters back and forth, quotes Gandhi saying that Gandhi had said, "I believe in the teachings of Christ, but you on the other side of the world do not. I read your Bible faithfully and see little in Christendom that those people who profess faith pretend to see." Dr. Holmes said that Gandhi pointed out that he saw Christians seeking wealth at the expense of others, and that the Christians are the most warlike people that he had ever met, rather than encountering or reflecting the image of a peaceful Christ that we read about in the Gospels, and especially again on the Sermon on the Mount. In short, you could sum all these things up by saying that Gandhi liked Christ, but it was the Christians that he had the problem with. Now, that's the great problem of our faith, isn't it? That people encounter Christ, the teachings of Christ, and love Jesus, love what they see about Jesus, and then they come into the church or they encounter one of us, and let's just be honest, we're all hypocrites. I don't know any among us. I certainly am a hypocrite. Now, there are things that I profess and that I fall short on time and time again, and we struggle with that. That's the struggle of our faith, is to be consistent in the way that we live. The trouble that we have, though, are the times where we are blatantly opposed to what Christ teaches, even as we profess to follow Jesus. You see, we profess belief in Jesus, who boiled our faith down into loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves. Even as we proclaim this ethic of love, it is the unloving words of Christians that undermine our witness. We become disgusted with certain people or certain groups. We'll hold other people with contempt because we just can't imagine the way that they live or the choices they make. And so we push them off to the side, seeing them as less than ourselves. The one challenge, though, that we have is we cannot hate somebody and hope to reach someone at the same time. We can't hate somebody for whatever reason, because of who they are, their ethnicity, their nationality, their culture, their belief system, whatever it is, and yet still hope to meet them or share the gospel with them, because we won't truly have love for them. We live in a world of outrage, and we live in a time where outrage is really all the rage. We see it everywhere we go. In fact, sometimes I'll get on Facebook or even on Twitter, and someone will say on there kind of tongue-in-cheek, like, well, what are we raging about today, Internet? Because every day there seems to be something new that we are to be upset about. Our social media feeds are filled with outrage towards people different than us. We can feel disgusted towards people who think and believe differently than we do. And Christians are complicit in this outrage. We're complicit when we don't listen, when we fail to understand and try to meet people where they are, as Christ met us where we are. We're complicit in the outrage culture when we behave badly rather than allowing our lives to communicate the good news of the gospel message. And there's a disconnect when we are unable to discern how our hypocrisy destroys our witness. There's a disconnect in how we live and the message that we communicate when we claim to know the love of God and yet fail to show that love to the people around us. And when we do this, when we show we have not been truly gripped by, we show we've truly not been gripped by grace. We show that we've not truly understand that God's love is for others and that we also were the others because Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. Our words and our actions will either draw people to Christ or will push people away. There's a great opportunity here for us, church. There's a great opportunity for us to think about and to consider how it is that we act and live. Reverend Dr. Ed Stetzer, he talks about this in one of his books. He says that as Christians, he challenges us to live what he calls winsome love. Winsome love is a kind of love that draws people in rather than pushing them away. It's when we live out the gospel, when we live out the teachings of Jesus, and people are captivated by it. People say, what is so different about you? And they are drawn to that, to Christ, rather than being pushed away when we fail to live that out. Winsome love seeks to win some people rather than repulsing them away from Christ. The place I see this the best is the second chapter of Acts. If you guys remember reading through there, the second chapter of Acts is when the Holy Spirit comes on the disciples, 120 that are gathered in the upper room, and it's really the birth of the church. The Spirit falls, they hear a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and Peter and the others go out, and they start preaching in Jerusalem. And as they preach, the Spirit takes over. We're really not sure what the miracle is. Either Peter and the disciples start speaking another language, or the people listening start hearing the Hebrew that they're speaking or the Greek that they're speaking in their own language. Irregardless, there's a message, there's a miracle that takes place through the Spirit where people hear the gospel message, the good news. They hear that Jesus was alive, what he taught, that he was crucified and that he was raised from the dead. And it says that day that 3,000 put their faith in Jesus that day. That 3,000 were added to the number of the 120 that were there in the upper room that day. It's the birth of the church. And we often wonder how the church began and what it looked like. And Luke, the author of Acts, gives us two summary statements, one at the end of chapter 2, another at the end of chapter 4. But at the end of chapter 2, in this summary statement, it's a statement, Luke is summing up what the church looks like in the book of Acts and during the time immediately after Jesus' death. Luke tells us the early church was known for several things. The early church, they were learning the Jesus way by their devotion to the disciples' teaching. They daily gathered to listen to the teachings of the disciples. It says that they broke bread together, they shared meals together, and because of this, fellowship occurred. Now, we call getting together somewhere fellowship, right? We have a fellowship hall. In the Greek, in the biblical understanding, fellowship is the result of doing something together for the purpose of the gospel. That is fellowship that takes place. The disciples, this early church, they sold their possessions to care for anyone that had need. That if there was a need there, they pulled their resources, they did anything they could to help the person out that had a need. In fact, if you go over to chapter 4, it says that not only did they care for them, that they would sell property in order to care for the people of the church. This is what they're known for. They met for worship daily, and they were known for having glad and sincere hearts. Because of this, Luke adds that the early church enjoyed the favor of all the people. Hypothetical question: does Milford enjoy the favor of Avenue Church today? Does the world in general enjoy the favor of the church? When they look at the church, do they see how we care for the poor, how we love each other? Do they see joy on our face? Or do they encounter something different? The early church wasn't argumentative. They weren't wearing the garb of their favorite Caesar. They weren't engaged in a culture war. They weren't walking around with frowns on their faces. They were known for the love they had for God, for one another, and for others. This was an image and is an image of winsome love for you and for me. It's an image for us of a church that is unified behind the purposes of Christ. Even though they were different, there's rich and poor, young and old, male and female, Jew and Gentile, yet their unity is not found in those things. They were found in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they lived with that purpose in mind for the betterment of all the people around them. In fact, when you talk about winsome love as we deal with COVID and all that's going on now, when you look through the various plagues that have gone through our culture and our world, especially in some of the plagues that have happened in Rome after the time of Christ, the Romans left. The people who practiced what we would call paganism left Rome and left everyone infected with the plague to die on their own. Who was still there? It was the Christians who nursed them back to health, who helped Rome and other places recover from these plagues because they felt that it was the love of Christ that compelled them to care for the least of these. This is winsome love. This is why the church grew. That even in the face of persecution, in the face of plague, that Christians continued to love and continued to show that love out. And so here's what happens. Luke goes on to add, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Why? Preaching, sure, yes. Signs and wonder, yes. Caring for the poor, loving one another, making sure everyone was provided for. Winsome love, the humble and sacrificial love of Jesus, draws people in rather than pushing them away. Perhaps you're a Beatles fan. I don't know if we have any Beatles fan. It's like the great question, right? Are you a Beatles fan or a Stones fan, depending on the age? I have to admit, I'm more Stones than Beatles, but that's okay. Don't throw any tomatoes at me. But, the Beatles had a song called All You Need Is Love, right? And you know the song, you'll start singing the song, it'll be in your head the rest of the afternoon. But sometimes in the church, I hear this all the time, like, all we need is love. We just need to love one another. And it is definitely true. We see that Jesus has an ethic of love. We also have to understand, well, what kind of love are we talking about here? You see, in the English language, we have one word for love. It's love, right? I love Andrea. I also love ice cream. It's up to you to decide which one I'm more committed to, right? Andrea could probably tell you. I love my children, but, I love other stuff too. We have one word for it. In all the things that we talk about, we love stuff, but we have one word. In the Greek, there are at least 4 words. And some of them are like eros, which is a physical sexual love. One is philos, which we get Philadelphia from. It is a brotherly love that we share. The other one that we see a lot of times in regards to Jesus is the word agape. Agape is a form of love that lays itself down, that is sacrificial. When Jesus says that we should love our neighbors, not just our neighbors, but our enemies too, and to pray for them. You know what kind of love Jesus uses there? Or what kind of love the gospel writers record? It's agape love. It's not just brotherly love that, we're able to high five those that are different than us and kind of be, friendly to them. It's agape love. We're to agape our enemies. We're to lay our lives down. We're to live sacrificially. We're to even put their concerns ahead of our own. That's what it means to love. And so when we talk about loving one another, it is not just a love that lets anything, we love, peace, love, and all this stuff. And it's not a wishy-washy love where everything is okay, I'm okay, you're okay. It's not allows a relativism or anything like that. It is a love that sacrifices and lays itself down. The other thing that's important for us that I think to keep clear is that loving our neighbor doesn't mean that we have to compromise our convictions. It doesn't mean that we have to be wishy-washy in our faith and say, oh, well, I'm okay, you're okay. Love means, when we love someone, that we may have to practice tough love. Some of you as parents have practiced tough love with your kids, right? Doesn't mean you love them any less. Try to tell our kids, we won't tell any stories about them, but we discipline our kids because we love them. We're not trying to be mean. Andrea and I don't want to be mean to our kids. But we discipline them because we think there's a better way, or there's a teaching moment there. And so we practice tough love as a form of love. And Dan talked about this last week, that when we love someone, when the discipline is placed, when we need to address something, it's not for the purpose of putting someone in their place, it's for the purpose of restoring and reconciling. Then when we love someone, when we hold someone accountable in the church because of love, it is for the purpose of reconciling them both to God and to ourselves. And so love means that we will still disagree. We will still have areas in our lives that we disagree on. But yet love shapes how we disagree. And I think this is so important for us because what I've seen in the last 6 months, last year, last 4 years, last 8 years in the political discourse, both out in the world and in the church, is that if you disagree with me on this political issue, if you disagree with me on this theological issue, then I will just cancel you out. We'll just go our own ways. But love says we can disagree but still be united in the message of the gospel. We can disagree and still be of one mind when it comes to living out our faith in Jesus Christ. Winsome love doesn't speak to whether we disagree, rather it shapes the way we disagree. Rather than trying to win arguments, proving our points, or practicing shutdown tactics, winsome love seeks to maintain the relationship. As Christians and in our lives, winning an argument is often going to mean that we lose the relationship. Right? Think about your marriage. For those of you who are married, if you win an argument with your spouse at the expense of caring for your spouse, you've lost the argument. If the outcome with your spouse is win and lose in an argument, you've lost, even if you think you've won. When we're in a relationship with other people who are different from us, people maybe that we hope to share the gospel, if we win an argument with them, we've probably lost the opportunity to share Christ with them. There's a saying, no one ever came to Christ because they lost an argument. They come to Christ because they see Christ in us and the way they experience us. Think about Jesus in the stories we heard today. Jesus had all the ability to do mic drop moments, right? He could have just dropped the mic on Judas, who was ready to betray him, with the Roman soldiers that beat him and spit on him, that crucified him. Could have dropped him, could have won the argument, could have come off the cross, said, hey guys, this isn't going to work. Instead, what did Jesus do to Judas, who was about to betray him, minutes away from betraying him? He washed Judas's feet as a sign of sacrificial love, a servanthood. What did Jesus say to the Roman soldiers that crucified him on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And this is so important for us because we have to address this idea of winsome love with humility. And we see this in Paul's writing about Jesus. He says, in your relationships with others, you should have the same mind as Jesus Christ. That though he was God, he did not demand and cling to his rights as God. He made himself nothing and appeared in human form. And appearing in human form, he appeared as a slave, humbled himself even further. And as a slave, he became obedient to death. That Jesus was God, is God, but he set it aside to make a way and to serve, to show us what love looks like. And so humility is not losing, it is not weak, it is not cowardice. Our culture teaches us that those around us who are humble are doormats, always getting stepped on. Yet biblically, we see that when we humble ourselves to listening and understanding the culture, worldview, and background of those who are different than us, then that opens the door so that we are able to share the love of Christ with them. Not only by our words, but by our actions as well. Winsome love done in humility shows we are more interested in a winning relationship than we are in winning the argument. Let me say that again. Winsome love shows that we are more interested in a winning relationship, a good relationship, a healthy relationship, more than we are about winning the argument. Friends, we have to be sure that we are not complicit in this age of outrage. We have to listen and learn to live in winsome love in our speech and our actions. And when we do that, Christ will draw people to himself through our lives. With the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg earlier this year and the naming of a new Supreme Court justice, this has been the source of one of our outrages in our country, hasn't it? Whether or not President Trump should nominate a new Supreme Court justice, whether he should wait till after the election, whatever it may have been, has happened. But that was a source of outrage. And so perhaps the same Supreme Court can show us an example of how Christians should live out winsome love for our neighbors. When Ginsburg passed away, stories of her career began circulating, and one that caught my eye was of Ginsburg and the late Justice Antonin Scalia. Ginsburg and Scalia were opposite ends of the ideological spectrum when it came to their understanding and interpretation of constitutional law. These were two legal giants who were often on the opposite ends of the Supreme Court vote. There have been times, in one story I read about Ginsburg talked about a vote that I think she lost, and Scalia wrote the report and gave her a tongue lashing in the report. But Scalia came to her and showed her the report before she was able to write her part of the docket. And Ginsburg said that it stung, but it helped her make and write a better report and a better case proceeding. They allowed their iron to sharpen iron in the midst of the process there. They were also best friends outside of the court system, outside of the courtroom. They both loved the opera and would attend together, often getting dressed up and having a good time while going about it. Their families spent New Year's Eve together for years. When news of Ginsburg's husband's death was announced in court, Scalia openly wept. Scalia and Ginsburg once rode an elephant together in India, and if you've never seen that picture, it's worth looking up on the internet. Ginsburg called Scalia her best buddy in an interview. Scalia was once asked if his friendship with Ginsburg had ever helped him in the courtroom. Antonin replied, "Some things are more important than winning an argument." To me, when I read this, it lights up in my head like this is how we're to live as Christians. They didn't compromise how they understood the interpretation of constitutional law, but when they came out of that courtroom, they sharpened each other's tools when it came to understanding the law, and outside of that, they continued to be friends who cared for one another to the very end, who loved one another. Here are two people who were able to set aside their differences on what they believed in order to be friends, sometimes confounding others with their friendship. In an age of outrage, they stand as an example for us of how we can exhibit winsome love for our neighbors. Remember, love doesn't mean compromising our beliefs. Love doesn't mean that we won't disagree with those around us. Love shapes how we interact. Love shapes how we disagree. Love keeps doors open rather than shutting them on those who are different than us. So friends, we have a choice to make. I have a choice to make today and each day that comes after this, and you have that same choice. And it's becoming more and more important that we make the choice today on how we're going to live. We can either choose to go the way of the world and silo ourselves off along with people who think like us, who look like us, who believe like us, and leave those who look differently behind. We can live in an echo chamber where we only surround ourselves with news sources and political views and theological views that are like ourselves. Or we can learn to live with winsome love. We can choose the way of Jesus, who eats with sinners, whose disciples included a Jewish traitor and an anti-Roman terrorist. We can choose the way of Jesus, who showed people grace and still called them to turn away from their sin. We can choose the way of Jesus where we lay down our lives for others because Jesus already laid down his life for us while we were still sinners. We can choose the way of Jesus, who loved the world even as the world crucified him. As we close today and the praise team comes up, we have a choice to make today. And it's not a one-time choice. It's a choice that we're going to have to make every single day, every time we have a relationship with someone. It's a choice that if you are a Democrat, when your MAGA hat-wearing relative comes to Thanksgiving dinner and tells you how the election was stolen, you have a choice in how you're to love. And if you are a supporter of Trump and your Democratic children come home and they want to talk to you about Joe Biden, you have a choice on how to live. As we think about our church and how we're to live and how we're to care for those around us, those who are different than us, those who believe different than us, those who live differently than us, we can either push those people off to the side and say, no, you're not welcome here. Or we can practice some messy, welcoming community that says, you know what, we're all sinners. Let us encounter God's grace together and allow God's love to show through our lives. We have a choice to make. Are we going to be known by our love? Or are we going to be known by the things we're against? Let's pray together.